I'm Michael Frandsen, a Director of Public Affairs for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I'll be moderating this discussion. I am delighted to be joined by this distinguished panel, including Angela Carmella, Professor of Law at Seton University School of Law, Hollman, General Counsel and Associate Executive Director at the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, Erik, Director of the International Studies Program and Associate Professor in Theology and International Studies at Boston College, and Michael Ware, founder of Public Square Strategies and author of the book Reclaiming Hope, Lessons Learned in the Obama White House About the Future of Faith in America. Welcome, everybody, and we really appreciate you joining us today. We look forward to your insights and your observations as we discuss a topic that relates to a lot of what we're seeing in the news lately in one way or another. The common good is sometimes thought about in terms of what promotes human flourishing, and here perhaps are a few indicators of human flourishing taken directly from some headlines I've noticed over the last couple of weeks. For example, this from the New York Times, the headline reads, "New milestones in jobs report signal a bustling economy." Quoting from the article, "The American economy roared into overdrive last month." The Labor Department reported Friday, extending the longest streak of job growth on record and echoing other recent signs of strength. The unemployment rate fell to 3.8%, its lowest level since the heady days of the dot-com boom in early 2000. But then this, just a few days ago from The Atlantic. Poor Americans really are in despair. The wealth gap is also a happiness gap. The story cites two recent reports from the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, noting that suicides in this country are up nearly 30%. And life expectancy in the U.S. dropped for the second year in a row, largely as a result of what some have termed diseases of despair. And finally, this from Ross Stafford in a recent New York Times column titled "Grim Trends in Good Times," who seem to connect these two trends. As the economic picture has improved, Stafford notes, the social picture hasn't. And then he points additionally to birth rates that are declining, the opioid epidemic dragging down American life expectancy, and other indicators such as deaths from liver disease, which suggest the struggles that those around us might be experiencing. Granted, these headlines are incomplete and selective, but what are we to make of them and the starkly different views they present of society as we consider the common good today and how religion can help contribute to it? I look forward to a lively discussion of this topic with our panelists, but before diving in, let me offer a bit more formal introduction of them. You'll find their complete bios in the program. Hollman is the General Counsel and Associate Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C., an organization dedicated to the historic Baptist heritage of defending religious liberty for all people and preserving the institutional separation of church and state. Holly provides legal analysis and insight on church-state issues that arise before Congress, the courts, and administrative agencies. She leads the Baptist Joint Committee's involvement in legal cases through Friend of the Court briefs, and her tenure includes dozens of briefs filed by the BJC, including more than 20 at the United States Supreme Court. She often discusses matters relating to church-state relations with members of the media, appearing in numerous publications and broadcasts. She writes a regular column for the BJC's magazine, and her work has been published by both scholarly outlets and major newspapers. Erik Owens was recently appointed Director of the International Studies Program at Boston College, where he is also an Associate Professor of the Practice in Theology and International Studies at Boston College. His research explores a variety of intersections between religion and public life, with particular attention to the challenge of fostering the common good of a religiously diverse society. Prior to his current appointment, he served for 12 years as Associate Director of the Blasey Center for Religion and American Public Life. He received his PhD in Religious Ethics from the University of Chicago, an MTS from Harvard Divinity School, and a BA from Duke University. is the founder of Public Square Strategies, LLC, and a leading expert and strategist at the intersection of faith, politics, and American public life. As one of President Obama's ambassadors to America's believers, Michael directed faith outreach for President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. He was also one of the youngest White House staffers in modern American history. He served in the White House Faith-Based Initiative during President Obama's first term, where he led evangelical outreach and helped manage the White House's engagement on religious and values issues, including adoption and anti-human trafficking efforts. Today, Public Square Strategies is a sought-after firm that helps religious organizations, political organizations, businesses, and others effectively navigate the rapidly changing American religious and political landscape. And then Angela Carmella was a professor of law at Seton University School of Law, focusing on the intersection of law and religion, specifically the First Amendment's religion clauses, religious land use, and Catholic social thought. Her writing engages a wide range of issues, including litigation positions taken by religious institutions, religious exemptions, the exercise of religion by for-profit entities, the special concerns of religious nonprofits, zoning impacts on religious groups, and the Second Vatican Council's teaching on religious freedom. To kick this off, let's start with a question that's perhaps foundational to the rest of our discussion. And we'll turn to you first, Erik. Let's start with how you would define the common good, perhaps from your own perspective or from the perspective of your faith tradition. What constitutes the common good?
Well, thank you, Michael, for having me here, and thank you for all of the terrific people who have made this event possible. There's an enormous undertaking. I wasn't aware of how many moving parts there were, and so thank you all. It's really an honor to be here and on this panel with such terrific people. I think in the sort of general discourse or the kind of common parlance out there around the world, the idea of working for the common good usually means attending to the good of all citizens, right? Or in the sort of language of the constitutional preamble, the working for the general welfare, right? Thinking about the good of all, as opposed to the special interests of factions or individuals. And I think that sensibility of the common good makes sense. It's democratic. It's sort of vaguely utilitarian in the sense that it looks to the greatest good of all and things like that. But it also can overlook some of the inequalities in wealth, inequalities of power, the sorts of things that Michael just mentioned in his preamble, in his opening remarks about some people are doing well in our broader American community and even in our smaller neighborhoods, whereas some people are doing terribly well, both spiritually, economically, socially, etc. And so I think that the sort of just generally idea of working for the common good isn't quite robust enough of a concept. And so I think we can look to what I would consider to be a deeper and definitely an older perspective that reaches back to a tradition that's more, a definition that's more fundamental and more relational. And in this sense, the common good is an ancient concept in political theory and in political theology that offers a vision of human flourishing that is rooted in a recognition of human interconnectedness and sociality. So it links the good of individuals with the good of communities in which they belong without exalting one over the other. And so you can see that it offers an alternative in this model to theologies or ideologies or political theories that are grounded in purely or exclusively individualist models of one person against the many, or collectivist models of the many against the individual. And while I'm talking about an ancient Greek tradition that's brought forward to the Western world, the idea that the individual and the community are linked together is something we find in cultures and traditions around the world throughout history. But I think, in my opinion at least, it's been honed most finely within the Catholic tradition of social thought in the past 100 years or so, and that's something I know Angela can speak to as well. And we'll maybe get to that later. But that's how I'd start with an understanding of the common good.
Very good, thank you. Holly, did you want to add to that?
Well, as an advocate who works for an organization totally dedicated to really sleeping, that kind of to the question is, what do we mean by common good as it relates to religion and as it relates to government? And I think, we might generally, those of us who are religious people might generally think, of course, our religion contributes and cares about the common good. I think that seems so normal and moral, and of course, we do that. But when we think about the role of religion being quite different from the role of government, and the role of religion in speaking for itself and expressing itself certainly can contribute and should contribute to the common good. Religious principles that we find across religious traditions, such as those that say we should love our neighbors, treat others as we want to be treated. Certainly those religious principles and practices that serve others and meet needs are very important and contribute to the common good. When I think about religious liberty in the common good, I really think about the need for religion and religious people to affirm more clearly an understanding of religious freedom for all. And that when we do that, that's sort of foundational common good assertion, right? That in America we have this great tradition of religious freedom, and to the extent that we understand it and protect it and hold it up, it provides for the common good, both so that religion thrives in all its diversity. I was speaking about the good things religion does, but honestly we know that not everything religion that's done in the name of religion is good. It protects that place for religion, but also for citizens who aren't religious. So I think a real commitment to religious liberty in the historic American tradition is something that serves the common good because it embraces both religious people and non-religious, and is something that serves the common good very well.
Great, very good. Thank you.
Well, I think in picking up on Erik's comments, I'll agree that my Catholic grandmother would be very glad I'm saying this as well. The Catholic social teaching has really provided the most robust treatment of this idea. And I think of common good as the sum total of social conditions which allow people as groups and individuals to reach their fulfillment more fully and easily. And it's important in the Christian conception of the common good. We're thinking especially preferentially about the flourishing of the vulnerable in communities. And so you'll notice in those headlines that were read, we are paying more attention as Christians to certain headlines as examples of how well-functioning society is. I think of, if you think of sort of the Constitution and the basic structures of government as sort of the hardware of our politics and our system of laws, the common good is kind of the software. It's kind of a guiding ethic that can guide citizens and lawmakers as they're making choices about the future of the nation. The last point I'd add, though, is I think we've like so many concepts that have sort of political salience, when they speak about the common good, there are often attempts to narrowly prescribe specific policies that represent what the common good is and could be, and I would just caution against developing a particular political program as a sort of implementation of the common good in its fullness. And I think that'll probably come up later in our conversation.
Is there a risk then that, so if it's good for you, then it must be the common good?
There's a fundamental other-centeredness about the Christian conception of the common good. That yes, our fates are all tied together. Yes, and especially in a system of government where citizens, where we hold an office, a political office as citizen, we do have to take into account our interests. I think that's part of how our government works. But for Christians, and with the common good in mind, there is a other-centeredness that is quite out of style in our politics right now, but that is critical to thinking Christianly about political engagement.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just kind of building on what everyone has said so far, but especially with respect to avoiding the particular prescriptions, at least jumping to them. I think in Catholic social teaching, one thing that I like to think about is the way rights are enumerated. You have not only the civil rights, the kinds of rights that we see in the Constitution, rights obviously to religious freedom, rights to expression and association, rights to participate in groups and in society and in the decision-making institutions, but also things like a right to have a family, a right to employment, to a decent wage, to good labor conditions, right to own property subject to social duties, rights to organize, rights to have the material necessities for the flourishing of the human person, the right to health care, the right to housing. Now, these are not rights that you assert against the government to say, provide these for me. These are the rights that then make a moral claim on the society to provide the conditions in which the rights are fulfilled. And so the healthy economy is key. Clean environment, food, good food, housing, safe housing, health care for everyone, protection of civil rights, a legal system that provides that, education for everyone. These all become the responsibilities of society. And I know they're at a very high level of generality, but when you think about the nature of the common good as basically who is my neighbor? And, well, everyone. And Catholic thinking has even moved beyond the national borders to using a concept called solidarity to say, well, in the world, everyone in the world. So I know these concepts are, need to be given specific meaning in specific contexts, and there's no blueprint, I think, quite intentionally. But I think we can, at least I like to think of the common good in this sense of rights and duties that create these conditions. And then we can look at our society and we can look at the conditions themselves to see if they're present for the flourishing of all, not just those who have the means.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up something that, Michael, I think you were sort of alluding to, but as you look across the current political and cultural landscape, do you see people talking in terms of the common good, or at least grappling with what it means? And if not, then what's framing our current sort of cultural and political discourse?
There are some bright spots, but we are in a political era right now that is defined in large part by rampant tribalism and bitter polarization, and a politics of self-interest, which is directly opposed to politics of the common good. I'll give you an example. In the 1960s, parents were asked, who do you not want your child to marry? And in the 1960s, parents responded, I would not want my child to marry someone of a different race. I would not want my child to marry someone of a different religion. In 2013, the same question was asked. Parents responded, if they were Democrats, I would not want my child to marry a Republican. If they were Republican, I would not want my child to marry a Democrat. Now, there are all, from the political consequences are clear. We're living in it right now, but just the basic questions of social cohesion, for how we live together, for how we care for one another, are deeply tied up in these concepts. Again, just to emphasize, the common good doesn't offer particular political policy prescriptions, but if think about how much healthier our politics would be if instead of politicians basically running for elected office, appealing to 50+1% of the country and or their districts, and understanding that if they turn out certain percentages of these base demographics that make up their political support, then they'll be able to win. Well, then we wonder that we have a Congress full of elected officials who think that they're only accountable to the people who voted for them. And that's because we have a politics that's about getting elected, staying elected, and serving those who brought you there, as opposed to a spirit of public service and the common good. It's a fundamental problem, and there there are structural changes that we can make. There's a conversation that's just perked up over the last month or so about having ranked voting, which is something I think we need to consider, considering having multiple members representing each district. But at the core of this is just a civic problem, that we don't have the civic character to support politics of the common good, and that's ultimately up to each one of us.
Increasingly more difficult to sort of look beyond ourselves or to look at a situation and try to understand it if the tables were turned, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. When I thought about the question is, do we hear about that a lot? I would say no. And yet, here we are, room full of people who came out to talk about this and who care. And in my day-to-day experience in Washington, I see these negative consequences of such divisions and such difficulty. But in order to work there and to work toward any good, you actually have to get past that. You have to pick up the phone, you have to meet face-to-face, and you find ways that you can work together. And so, and in my life flying across the country in the air, talk to people in airports, talk to people beside me on the airplane, and you find that regular people are much more willing to talk about commonalities and to complain about the partisanship and the divisions and to be eager to find a connection with someone who comes from a different religious or political perspective than we would often say. So that's the positive note on what is a very difficult situation. I think that there is a yearning that there will be more efforts together to work toward the common good. And I think this conference and focusing on religious freedom is a big part of that, because religious freedom has always been one of the areas where people could come together and find common ground. We are not religiously the same. We are religiously diverse. We are diverse within our own traditions. We're not going to agree in matters of religion, but we have long maintained this kind of fundamental religious freedom environment, kind of like Professor Carmella was talking about, the conditions, right, for doing things, and that's really what's at stake now. So I think this is what we need, the hard work of conversation.
Yeah, I admire what's already been said in the panel for sure. I want to affirm all that. I think, you know, if I had to look outside, I don't see a lot of discourse of the common good, that exact language, but I think some of the policies that are fiercely antagonistic to the conception of the common good that we've been just describing has engendered a response that's reminded people that this is in our tradition, both political tradition, cultural tradition, religious traditions, etc. And, you know, to get back to my earlier comments about interconnectedness, this is one of my biggest worries about our current political culture, is that we're pressing on differences among us and not seeing that the wealthiest among us are connected to the poorest among us in economic terms, and that those with strong legal protections are connected to those with weak legal protections in this country. We're tied together inevitably, and when the political culture is pushing on the idea that we need to separate ourselves from the vulnerable or the marginal or the people who aren't considered to be core to the American project in some calculated way, I think that's just deeply destructive of the conditions for the possibility of talking about the common good that we mentioned, whether those politics are racialized or whether they're in terms of religion or in terms of nationality or whatever. The lack of recognition that we're in this together in so many different ways is one of the most troubling things. And I think it's enhanced by the way that we create and live in echo chambers, both technological in terms of, you know, our Facebook feeds and things, but also the communities. We're highly segregated, as Michael mentioned. You know, famously, Americans now want to hate the idea most of having you marry someone of the other party, so we're sticking with the birds of a feather politically as well, and that's really destructive of the idea that we can live together. And I think that political cultures can foster better and worse approaches to that sensibility, and I think we can do better.
I would just add one thing to all the excellent comments, and that is that, again, kind of coming from Catholic tradition, but I think, again, it's sort of ancient, is that the common good is everyone's job. It's not something that the government does. It's not something that a particular institution, it's not just for universities or courts or whatever. It's all individuals, all institutions. And in fact, civil society, the government is just part of the very large civil society in which we have all of these non-state institutions, and that promoting the common good is really something that is incumbent upon all of us. So, and I think one of the big distortions that I guess it's always been an issue, but particularly acute now, is the money that is behind very different movements. And, we discover that social media gets overtaken with, particular ideas, and that there are campaigns sort of behind the scenes. We I think need to get back to kind of a more authentic way of having these very public conversations, not driven or guided only by money that is, somewhere behind them. So.
Thank you. I don't think any of us here would suggest that there was sort of once this sort of golden age of the common good, and we've kind of left that behind us. On the other hand, I think there is a sense among a lot of people that something has changed. The way we talk about things, the way we organize now, in a lot of substantial ways seems different to me now than when I was younger. The way my high school textbooks talked about the way civil society was supposed to work was, there was a lot more correlation, it seemed. So as we think about religion and the common good, are there some things that have changed that have sort of shaped the way we kind of influence the things we're talking about right now? Or if we agree that things have changed, what has changed? What's the source of that?
Well, I think part of the source is we found that people are being discipled more by politics than by their faith. And so we have a pervasive political culture that is shaping and forming who we are as people. I talk with pastors and clergy all over the country who are up against the very hard reality of the fact that they have their members an hour and a half a week, maybe if they come in on Wednesdays or on another day throughout, maybe 2.5 hours a week. Well, talk radio has them on the drive to work and home from work for 2 hours a day. And then they get home and then they watch cable news. And so there is this sort of, in many aspects of the religious community, we have a pervasive sort of public theology crisis, a lack of formation in public things. And then I'd also point out, I think understanding we live in a pluralistic society is really important, but part of living in a pluralistic society means that people are free to bring their full selves to our public debates, and that actually we can be free to not to come to conversations about the common good with our religious conceptions that we believe to be true for everybody, even if we disagree with our neighbors about exactly what those conceptions are, that we're free to actually bring those to our discourse. And I think for so long, for a number of political and historical reasons, we've kind of fallen prey to this idea that our ideas must be unmoored from any tradition. And when that happens, people can be easily swayed, easily taken up, and eventually fall inwards on themselves if they're not left to any grounding tradition or community of thought.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else?
Well, I think what's evident to all of us is that the nature of religious diversity in our country has changed a lot in the past 50 years. I mean, in some parts of America, I guess it's still possible to not feel that, but I think in most places it's pretty dramatic. And when we talk about religious freedom, it feels different, I think, in 2018, because we can't take for granted what we mean by religion in the same way that might once have been able to have happened, in certain rooms at least. We know that there has been religious diversity, many different faith traditions, Native American traditions, European traditions, other Eastern traditions as well in this country, since we've talked about it as a place and as a country. But at the same time, since, the immigration reforms in the 1960s and the massive influx of Eastern religions in particular, but people from all over the world, America looks different religiously. And so religious freedom feels different. And I think that one of the challenges of religious freedom when we think about the common good is recognizing that if religious freedom means anything, it means that there is going to be there will be more strangers in our everyday lives. As one person put it, Laurie Patton, who studies Hinduism, put it, or more technically, that we ought to legitimize an indeterminate number of legitimate religious traditions in our country. We'll be thinking that there are going to be more differences among us, not less, in the future. And what kinds of daily practices can we create so that we can live with that, with the same principles that we want to embrace around religious freedom, not in a mode of fear or anxiety or animosity, but rather in the spirit of the common good in which we're all attached to each other. And I think that's a really big change, and it's not a small struggle to get to know different ways of life, and different parts of our country experience it differently, of course. In our urban areas, I think that this diversity is really most pronounced, but it's happening all over the place. You can find Hindu temples and such all over this country, and that's a big difference. And let me say one more thing, just from a religious studies perspective, is that we also, along with that, this sort of theoretical background of that, is that we also ought to be, it sort of problematizes the idea of religion. There might have been a thing for some people when you know what religion means. You think you have an idea of what that means. And I think that more radical diversity challenges that understanding of what you mean by religion. So you have to start talking about that. For many people, religion is a way of life. It's not a pattern of belief or a belief in a particular credo or a doctrine or something like that, such that you can be a secular Jew or a secular Hindu, for example, and speak in their practices and beliefs and traditions and ways of being, where religion is a fluid construction. And that's not to take away from the reality of what religion is in our lives or the truth that's embedded in it, but how people see religion is quite different. And more diversity helps us to re-examine what we mean by religion. And that's a healthy thing that needs to take place. And that, too, is a part of working toward the common good and being more inclusive, I think.
Yeah, I just quickly add, I completely agree. What's important is that the re-examination takes place and that the changes don't just occur and we actually don't talk about them. And so the predominant religious change in this country over the last 20 years has not been an influx of any new religious group. It's been religious disaffiliation and the rise of those who don't affiliate with a religion at all. And so this presents a challenge, I think, to policymakers. It presents a challenge to religious bodies in general, but you're absolutely right. Religious people no longer have the sort of, can no longer rely on cultural assumptions about religion and sort of people. It used to be simply by being an American, even if you weren't religious yourself, you knew what it meant to be a religious person. That is no longer the case. It's actually a pretty profound moment for a missional moment. For the first time, religious organizations have the honor of sharing with their fellow Americans what it means to be religious to Americans that don't have a context for that. When we talk about the religious freedom situation, though, this is especially important because you have policymakers, and especially the next generation of policymakers, will be the first to have grown up in a country where religious knowledge was not pervasive. And these are people who will be making decisions for all of us about what is religion, what amounts to a sincere religious claim, what is the proper balance of religion with other forces in society. And so that religious education, either from a state level, like they have in the UK, or religious organizations taking the burden on themselves, is just going to be really paramount if we're going to navigate this changing society.
So you're pointing to a trend that that's increasingly shown out through polling and research that Pew and others do, which is that more and more people, especially younger people, say that they don't affiliate with any particular organized religion. Many of them say, well, they're still spiritual, but don't participate in organized religion. Perhaps related to that, it's also increasingly common for people to challenge the idea that religion even has a role in answering questions about what's best for society. They're skeptical about religion's influence in the public square. How would the conversation be different if only secular voices could speak to these questions? How would it cause us to look at things differently?
We certainly hope the conversation would be different. If people who are religious in this room certainly hope they're contributing something, right? I don't really think we have to worry about that. I really do think our religious liberty tradition protects religious expression. We're just in a different time, in a different place. And as Michael said, we can't make the same assumptions. You know, it used to be, in my cultural context, the South, you know, the preacher was deferred to. That's not the case. Now the preacher's questioned in the line after the service because they heard something different. People heard something different in the news. So, you know, we should acknowledge the changes and what's going on in the environment, where people get their news and influence. But these challenges are also great opportunities for some churches, some religious traditions to refocus on what's most important. And in order to protect their value in the public square, to really push back against that political culture and that politicization of religion. I think that's a big challenge, and unfortunately in our political discourse, there's a very prominent example, if I can be specific, of someone saying the major religious liberty challenge is the fact that churches cannot endorse candidates with tax-exempt funds. I beg to differ that that is not a major religious liberty challenge. In fact, that shows part of the problem, is that we have not protected and honored and thought about religion in this this place that's separate and distant from government, where people come together and for religious purposes and for higher reasons or common good reasons that are quite different and broader than our partisanship. So I think there are difficulties and there are changes, but many churches, I think, that are struggling with that are also finding great opportunities to speak more clearly, take advantage of the conditions that we have in America to speak truth, to speak from the religious voices, to talk back to political leaders, and I think that's what we need to do.
Yeah, I would, just adding on to that, I think it's the rise of the nuns, the NONES.
Though I do love thinking about the rise of the Catholic nuns.
Of the nuns, yeah.
Complete national takeover.
Absolutely. I'm not, there's a correlation, not suggesting a causation, but the loss of moral authority from some of the churches with respect to, like, the sex abuse scandals. I mean, that did tremendous damage publicly. And then the very political activity, which was completely allowed but chosen by churches with respect to efforts against gay marriage for many years, from I guess the early 2000s through Obergefell. That created some real tensions with the gay community, feeling very disaffected, and a lot of that language of discrimination and the assumption that they're being discriminated against, I think, comes from a lot of that activity, and also the very, very intense focus on pro-life or anti-abortion movement. Again, perfectly consistent with the teachings of churches and our political expectations with respect to being out there in the public square, but I think the sort of the intensity of focus on abortion and gay marriage, for folks who are not in a religious community, not being raised in a religious community, that's pretty much what they know about some of the big churches in the country. And so now overcoming that, I agree with Michael and Holly that yes, absolutely, is a huge opportunity right now. I know James Martin is a Jesuit priest who's attempting to just talk about gay and lesbian persons as having dignity and being part of a church. If they're Catholic, or if they've left the church thinking that they're not welcome. It's been very controversial. But also, he speaks at various parishes and to full audiences where, people, family members who have nephews or sisters or whatever, right? So this is a very, very difficult issue, and I'm not trying to minimize it, and I'm not criticizing the actions of the religious communities for standing where they felt they needed to stand and taking the positions they need to take. But I think some of the fallout from that may be some of the issues with the nuns. And so I don't know if, Michael, if you have a different take on that, or Erik, you want to...
Well, it's interesting because just building upon what you said, the faith communities would say that they were speaking out for things that they saw were fundamental to the common good.
Yes.
And that they were obligated to speak out. So it does raise a question, does pluralism allow for a shared understanding of the common good? And if not, then how do we work together with others who have a different view, an increasingly different view of the common good?
I think that's the million-dollar question for the common good. I mean, embedded within the conception of the common good is a sort of implied unity, right? Or at least some shared something or other, right? And the question for those of us who think that that's important is to ask what's the nature of that commonality? What is the relationship of pluralism to the question of the common good? And I think if you do define the common good as a uniformity or a shared list of exact values and definitions of those values, then of course that's implausible at this table, let alone in this room, let alone in this country, right? That's simply not possible. There have been many attempts over the years to create, global ethics, like Hans Kuhn's global ethics, or the sort of UN Declaration of Human Rights, or these are just attempts to try to establish some basic principles. But that simply, in many ways, while it's extraordinarily important, it kicks the can down the road, because then you argue about what you mean by those things, as opposed to the words themselves, and that's where the rubber meets the road. But from my sensibility, I think it raises the question of what is the scope of the common good? What is the size of community in which the common good might be a meaningful concept? Pluralism brings that question to the fore, as does secularism, and makes us ask, is it possible in a country like the United States with 340 million people to have a conception of the common good? And for some of us, I think that it makes us look toward the more what you might call formal or procedural model of understanding what the common good is, rather than a more substantial model where you list the things that we all need to agree on. But instead we can say the common good are the conditions for the possibility of human flourishing, as we've heard here, or the common good might be the agreement for full and free discourse about the common good, such that everybody is represented in the conversation about what's most meaningful to our country, or to our people, or to our community, etc. And if voices are not heard, if they're excluded structurally or systematically, that someone speaks up for them, or makes those voices heard. And that's a way in which pluralism can be brought into the conversation, even if we can't find a unitary example of the policy or the value in question. We can bring more people into that conversation, and that's embracing pluralism within this model, I think.
Yeah.
Eric's just last comment, in the afterword to my book, I touch on Paul's letter to the Galatians, where Paul was basically writing to a community that was formed around his teachings, but he left and sort of everything fell to pieces. False teachers came in, sin, parochial motives kind of tore the community apart. And yet, I mean, he's basically writing to a community that's dealing with polarization. And I think we would tend to think like the wisest thing to do in that circumstance would be to advise some sort of like power sharing. I think of like, proposals to partition Iraq, like let's just find a way that you guys can live together without killing one another. And instead, Paul writes to them that they ought to bear another's burdens, and that in that they'll show the love of Christ. And I think we're in a moment right now where unless we find the resources to bear another's burden in our politics, that we're going to continue in this vicious downward spiral of self-interest. Now, what that means concretely is, there are elected officials right now who are representing districts that they have robust, let's say, African-American population, but it's only 30%, and they know that they could win without them. And so they get elected without ever having to appeal to 30% of their district. But they do have thriving white evangelical megachurches. So when those white evangelical pastors have the opportunity to be with the member for 15 minutes, are they using 5 of their minutes to raise the concerns of their African-American brothers and sisters to the member that they don't have access to? And the exact opposite is true. There are urban areas where there are major churches or other communities that are represented, but the member never feels compelled to reach out to those communities because there's no discrete political benefit where we need to create the political benefit and the political cost to not listening to those who are different than us. Out of a utilitarian sense that if we aren't doing it for anybody, no one's going to do it for us, but then out of a firm commitment to the common good and the fact that if we're going to have and advance the common good, it needs to involve everybody in the conversation.
It's about, in part, the health of our body politic, right? I mean, we talk about this sometimes in medical terms, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone today who's aware of what's going on that thinks our body politic is healthy, that we have a healthy political culture, that things aren't toxic in some way. Now, there's a lot of root causes and proximate causes and things that are happening here and there, symptoms of this or that point to something else, but we're at risk of sort of toxic shock in our political culture, I think, and that's really scary. I mean, I'm not an alarmist and I'm not a nostalgist, who thinks that there was some golden era, because most eras in the past had a lot of problems that I wouldn't want to embrace now. But I think that there's also, with any historical imagination, we can realize that history is not linearly designed to make things better in the future, that things can get worse, and that it requires action on behalf of the common good for these things to turn around. And hopefully it won't have to be heroic action, in the sort of, Bonhoefferian, sense or something like that, but more substantially that all of us feel obliged to be a part of returning some sort of health to the body politic, even when we disagree. Learning how to disagree better and not have it be existentially grounded, is a good starting point, I think.
And wouldn't that start with having a sort of self-examination? And I think that's good for religious people and secular people. It's like, what is it that I'm fighting for? What's really important to me that I've been speaking out boldly on, that I've been pointing the finger at the other side for? Well, what effect does that have on other people? Just to start off with the first simple recognition of others. I mean, we're saying it. We're saying that we have all this conflict, but do you stop and recognize, this is maybe back to the who is my neighbor question. Just recognize the person who disagrees, the person that you feel threatened by, and I think that really has to be a starting point to move forward. And I'm cheering for the religious people to step up and take advantage of this moment in these hard these hard fights against sometimes these conflicts about civil rights issues and religious objectors, I feel like there are religious principles that would allow more reaching across and allowing this. And it's not to say that the opposite can happen. I'm not trying to say that religious people are better. I'm just pulling for us using religious principles that require us to see our neighbors and to love our neighbors, to examine what effect we have on others, and the policies that we or the protections that we are seeking now, or the things that we've said in the past that maybe we won't say again, but to recognize the effect on others.
Just very briefly, that sort of self-examination I absolutely agree with is so crucial, and it may just simply begin with whatever your own tradition of moral or religious reflection is, recognizing the human capacity to rationalize our self-interest. I mean, that's a fundamental core. You might call it sinfulness or pride or self-interest or whatever, and whether you read St. Paul or Reinhold Niebuhr or something like that, we should ask ourselves, are we using the words like the common good to justify the things that we want? Are we using words like justice or love or religious freedom or things like that in ways that are promoting my own interests rather than what those terms should mean? And that should be the starting point of any sort of conversation just in a civic sense as well. So I really appreciate your starting point there of self-examination.
Yeah, I fully agree. And we can take our own religious communities' experiences with ecumenical discourse, because everyone tries to work with other religious groups, and that is a really great model for engaging others in what John Courtney Murray, the theologian and sort of public philosopher, said that civic life was we're locked in argument, not locked, meaning together in argument, not standing a mile apart yelling at each other. Right, so it's a very, I like that image, and I think what it also does is that this re-examination is that it sort of forces us into connecting those things that are important with each other. So, for instance, if I had students who were actually very surprised that the Catholic bishops were outraged by what was happening at the border. And I said, well, that's just part of the pro-life teaching. It's all one teaching. It's because there's life and justice and dignity. And so it was very interesting and that's what I meant earlier when I said how young people might only hear certain things and not realize. So this is an opportunity for, really reintegrating the teachings of any religious community when it's speaking in public space. As a way of educating a lot of people who really don't like, as you said, a missional moment, educating people who have no context and no history.
That's right. We've mostly been talking about the common good from an individual perspective, looking at ourselves, how we individually can help promote the common good, how our faith can inform our approach to promoting the common good, our understanding of it. But there's another part to this as well, and so at the same time that we see more and more people respond saying that they don't identify with any particular organized religion, we see other trends as well. Trust in institutions generally is on a steep decline. It's not just organized religion, trust in the media, trust in government, any sort of institution. What role do institutions play in promoting the common good? And then along with that, what are the implications for promoting the common good when participation and trust in institutions is declining?
That's a tough one.
Mm-hmm.
Can you only accomplish this individually, or does it mean? But does it require that that working for the common good is done in concert with others, people who are like-minded, and typically that's been done through institutions, but those are weakening.
Well, I think, I'm sure that it's kind of cyclical. There's probably people who study this, and so I may be speaking out of school, but I'm thinking about the Catholic notion of subsidiarity. I mean, it's also a political theory notion, but subsidiarity, looking at civil society and then looking at the multiple mediating institutions, the structures of society, of course starting with family and neighborhood and moving out to other institutions that create, that mediate between the person and the state. That includes the market. Now it's technology. It includes universities and science, really the arts, everything. The media, press. So yes, they may be weakening, but I think that there have to be, that people within these institutions have to go deep and, sort of get those, sort of rise to the occasion, that they have to address a very new world. Technology has vastly changed the way we interact or fail to interact with each other. The sort of cyber issues that are now, I'm always going to meetings because I have to, because they're required, with respect to security and how law is changing and all of that. So I think that every institution is going to have to internally come to terms with serving the whole of society. And I think that because, one of the very positive things about things like social media is that you do have this democratizing effect. You have this, putting in the hands of individuals, and that may turn into a good thing in the sense of an awareness of, or a consciousness, a raising of consciousness with respect to actions that have impacts on everyone. And so that you're not just targeting a particular market. I guess reaching out so that multiple institutions working together, religious institutions working with universities, scientific institutions. I would love to see scientific institutions and religious institutions coming together. I would love to see medicine and religious institutions and universities. So sort of those, and I know that there are efforts on certain issues, but really coming together with respect to the economic inequities, with respect to understanding immigration, security, safety, peace, all of the things, those very general topics. I think universities play a very particular role, a convening function like this one, bringing people together from multiple disciplines. And so I would hope that universities might take up the banner for something like this.
Yeah, I think a pure individualism is a death knell to institutions, and when you don't have strong institutions, it makes democratic governance and participation cynicism-inducing. Now, the good news is that parallel to American individualism has been this communitarian strain. Oliver O'Donovan says that liberal democracy bears the crater marks of Christianity, and so sort of religious impulses and neighbor-oriented impulses have been a major part of the American story as well. And this is a time for leaning a little, not giving up on the dynamism and the entrepreneurial spirit of aspect of the American spirit, but this seems to me to be a time when we need to with all of their flaws, understand that the flaws in our institutions are a reflection of our own flaws. That the state of our politics is, in the end, a reflection of the state of our souls. And so getting over sort of these self-righteous impulses that if we just start our own thing or sort of operate independently, that's going to be the solution. We actually need to lean heavier into the communitarian impulses that this country has always had, but that are especially needed now.
Yeah. The idea of institutions is always assumed an understanding, a shared understanding of something, and it's that shared understanding of that something that led to the formation of an institution. If you don't have that shared understanding, then how in the world could you even develop a greater understanding of the common good? And
America's always benefited from having a diversity of institutions that reflect different shared understanding. What really, when you really get into sort of more nihilistic mindset, is when you have these atomized, dispersed understandings that never amount to anything that's durable, that's lasting, that's actually providing the constructive input into society.
Yeah, picture a flock of swallows taking the least resistance, the path of least resistance.
In D.C. we don't have many swallows, but I'm not sure we do here either.
Well, we'll open it up shortly to questions from the audience, but since this is a focus on the role of religion in contributing to the common good, what particular things, what's unique to religion, or at least your faith tradition and your understanding of the common good, things that we couldn't understand without religion? Any thoughts there?
I'll play the historic Baptist, so I got asked to be on the panel, right? And that's the historic, and it's one that's shared, that was spoken about this morning in the LDS tradition, most religious minorities, and lots of different traditions that have had the experience of being a minority, a persecuted minority, having had that experience and fought for a seat at the table, or equality and citizenship, there's a great responsibility to continue to do that for others, and reaching beyond where it's comfortable, for communities that you don't understand or don't know, but to understand that there's this religious contribution to government that recognizes we are created free in God's image, and to respect that, have to respect individual religious freedom as well as the coming together of religious communities. But in order to protect that, we need to speak up for religious freedom for all, not just our own interests, but to see how our interests affect others, and to make sure that that these rights are widely shared. So I think that it is. It's, of course, doesn't only have to come from religion to support religious freedom, but I do think there's an important and powerful way that religious voices can be great leaders of religious freedom to contribute to the common good.
You've said something, Michael, that's always stayed with me, or you wrote it, I guess, but you had said one time that politics has sort of taken on a role that it was never intended to play. I assume that you meant by that it was taking on a role that religion used to play, and there were some bad things that were coming out of that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I just became convinced, especially over the last few years, that politics is causing great spiritual harm in America, that Americans are going to politics to get spiritual needs met that cannot be met by politics, but politicians will pretend they could meet them if it will get your vote. So yeah, I think that's very much at the core of a lot of the political malpractice and political malady that we see right now. And what it distracts from is if people are going to politics to get their emotional and spiritual needs met, then it's much more difficult to go to politics for the purpose of the common good and for the purpose of serving your neighbor and loving your neighbor. And so we need to we need to divest ourselves of sort of this emotional fulfillment that we get out of politics, treating politics as a forum for self-affirmation and self-expression. And when we do that, there will be space enough in politics for its more discrete and limited purposes in a more healthy way. But I mean, the pop culturification of our politics is something that we need to be concerned about, and the temptation is to really despise it when it's someone else's culture that's being affirmed in our politics, and to just soak it up when yours is. You know, when the president speaks at the opening of NASCAR, you might have one reaction as opposed to the president giving a video at the NAACP Image Awards, and that we need to look to other figures. We need to look to other sources for that kind of those kinds of emotional needs being filled. That sort of need to know that the president understands you as a unique individual. Like, talk to your neighbor about that. Get to know your neighbor. You don't need the president to be in your living room every night affirming you as the unique, beautiful person you are. Though you are beautiful.
And thank you. I feel affirmed.
I think we should, something that hasn't come up as much here at least, is we need to also recognize that religion has taught us some hard lessons about the common good, or the lack of, in this country. Being in Provo, we've heard already, we've been speaking about religious persecution of the LDS community, but there are so many examples in this country where we see religious persecution at work. We see what's often called the original sin of slavery and racism in this country affirmed by religious communities. We see religious communities affirming white nationalism today. We see power struggles endorsed by religious traditions. We need those lessons too. Those are negative lessons that are important, and we set them alongside of these profound visions of love and justice that our religious traditions provide for us, our ethics of service, our commitments to one another. I think that it's frequently the institutions are secular institutions that provide space in our country for people with different religious commitments to come together, to work together, and to provide that common good. Whether it's government, whether it's a bowling league, whether it's the school board, all those things. There's a great group, part of what we call civil society, that many of you may be familiar with, called the Interfaith Youth Corps, that has as its premise that rather than sitting down and talking about the differences between religious traditions, we ought to get together and do something for other people while we happen to be different in the process, and we'll learn something about each other. And when people of goodwill get together, people of goodwill of different faith traditions or no faith tradition, get together to do something just and good, that is an extraordinarily powerful statement of what can happen and what the common good can look like. These are sometimes things where it's not just one community working alongside another, but people intermingling. And this is how we get to know each other. We get to know each other, again, not simply by having coffee and saying, tell me about your dogma, but rather about, tell me about your dog. Let's go for a dog, let's walk our dogs together. Or, more importantly, let's go repair this playground down the street that's become run down. Or let's get together and write a letter to our city councilor because the streetlights are out and it's making dangerous on our same street where you and I live together. Those kinds of joint things together are really powerful. Religious communities in our country throughout our history have shown enormous resources and capabilities in being active citizens. We talk about different kinds of civil rights movements, but there's millions of other examples as well, and those are powerful. So I'd want to make sure we keep those hand in hand, the recognition that religious communities as well as ideas can be deployed in oppressive ways, but also tap into these amazing resources for visions of love and justice and human flourishing that are really what you'd hope for in this conversation around the common good.
Yeah, in fact, it's something that's always been remarkable to me about our understanding of religious freedom, that in other continents, blood and treasures have been lost based upon those religious differences, but somehow in the American context, we're able to come together with others who disagree with us on some of the most fundamental questions of life, and yet we can come together and work for the common good, for things that we're all concerned about. So, Let's open it to the audience. I'm told that we've got some mics. We've got another 15 minutes or so. And since this is being shared through Facebook Live, it's important that you talk directly into the mic, otherwise you won't be heard. If you have, I guess on both sides there. If you have a question for the audience, we'll start right there.
Excellent conversation. This year is the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination. Few figures in the 20th century, I think, have done more just in terms of putting their life on the line for the issue of religious freedom. What does it say about sort of where we are that in so many of the current discussions of religious freedom, I'm in and out of D.C. fairly frequently, King is so rarely invoked as a figure. So it's a brilliant panel. Help me sort of understand the letter from the Birmingham Journal is one of the epic statements of the 20th century. That doesn't come up, or the moral or political implications. So what does it say about the quality of the religious freedom discussion that one of the most important figures in the 20th century, right, never comes up? And I'd like to hear from every one of the panelists.
Yes, thank you. I think one of the shifts that has occurred, I was actually just talking with someone about this a few days ago. The Reverend Dr. King is often referred to as Dr. King. Right. And there's been a definite shift away from the religious nature, and the religious freedom. That doesn't absolve us, but because we know better. But I think in the popular culture and the popular understanding, he's about equal rights, racial equality, and the whole history of the Black church and the movement and the involvement of so many religious people in the civil rights movement coming from the North, going to the, has kind of been lost. In fact, again, some students, I remember having conversations with them to I thought, remind them, but I was telling them they were hearing it for the first time. So I wonder if part of that, the failure to embrace him in the sort of religious liberty pantheon is the movement, which is, I guess, a sort of a secularizing tendency in the academy to move him away from his religious roots and religious context into a secular one. I don't know if that...
It's a good question, and our work on religious freedom, we talk about Martin Luther King a lot. We're fighting this attempt to get rid of the Johnson Amendment, which is simply a regulation that requires 501c3s not to use their tax-exempt funds to endorse and oppose candidates, to act like PACs. And in doing that, we talk about the important role of religion being apart from government, to speak truth to power, and often talk about Dr. King, reminding us that the church has to be the conscience of the state, right? Not the master or the servant of the state. But we're operating in an environment where religion has cozied up to political leaders, and political leaders are glad to, put on their religious, wear their religious hat to get the religious votes. So I think it's just a really difficult environment. I think we've taken a big hit in these last 10 years with the harsh religious freedom fights that we've been talking about. We've really lost some shared understanding about religious freedom being something that can hold us together, that has been nonpartisan, that says we have a lot of religious diversity, we can accommodate religious differences, but the government is a secular government that doesn't advance a particular religious view or a particular religious perspective. And I know I'm making a general statement here, we could debate that for hours, but as a general matter of conditions, I think that that we've lost some understanding of that. And I appreciate the question, and I'll take it not just as a question, but as a encouragement to continue to bring that voice to the table.
Yeah, I don't see, I take your point, Reverend, but I don't think from my particular approach, I hear about King, I teach about King, we have students dissertating on King, we talk about him in the context of political theology, we talk about him in the context of civil religion, about prophetic civil religion, as opposed to priestly civil religion. We hear about him in the renewal of the Poor People's Campaign. We hear he's invoked by left and right in the New York Times, editorial pages. I think that there's, and his monument stands, there now in Washington. I think the risk is less, again, just from my personal approach, the risk to me seems less that he's never invoked, but that rather he's become an anodyne figure that has lost the sort of edge that made him so powerful and so prophetic. And I think the renewal of the Poor People's Campaign will help with that, and I fully support that. But I think in my little orbit of theology, public theology, and political theology, those things, he's alive and well and speaking very forcefully.
Yeah, I'd just quickly say, and we've talked about this before, the desire to secularize King, as Angela noted, but also a trivialization of black faith and treating it as historical, cultural baggage that isn't meant to be real. That sort of the religious language of the civil rights movement was just sort of a cultural nicety, not anything that actually sustained the movement. That's a big debate happening right now. I think the record is pretty clear, but we see the appropriation of phrases and ideas that King used that try and take out the faith conviction that grounded it, but it's very hard to do with someone as deeply steeped in theology as King was. And so I don't think that's going to be lost even in this new sort of era of the civil rights causes we're seeing now. It's important to pay attention to.
Great. Thank you. We have time probably for 2 more questions. Are there others? Let's see.
I don't want to be a nitpicker or rain on the parade, but it does seem to me that the title of this session is erroneous. How can religion contribute to the common good? I think what we have been hearing until now is that religious belief and practice is, quote, a common good. It is not the job of religion to contribute to the common good. The common good today in our society may be very different, and is in fact very different from what it was decades ago. It's not the job of religion to contribute to what today's society views as the common good. It may be, and it is, the duty of religious faiths to carry out what is good and to try to do what is good. But the notion that religion should contribute to the common good, I think, is erroneous. It's not the job of religion to contribute to a common good. What do you think of that?
Thank you.
I think that's why the questions themselves really didn't go in that direction. I think we were talking about defining being the common good. I think we were. That's what it. So I think
the first question we talked about. So. Yeah.
One last question.
The planning committee.
Yeah, that's right.
Right here. As somebody who's been doing religious liberty work for almost 30 years, the one thing that was kind of everybody could agree upon was religious liberty was a good.
Yeah.
And it's only in the last number of years that I'm now seeing things like, oh, religious freedom is a code word for, and then name the evil.
And I'm wondering if you're concerned about this and, any comments you would have about it.
Very concerned. As someone who has to tell people, they say, what do you do? I work for the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. We joke that used to be Baptist was what threw people off. What kind of Baptists are we? Because Baptists are congregational based and very diverse and have different strains. But now people are like, well, what does the religious liberty part mean? So it's a concern. I think that I heard your question in a negative, that it sounds like we're losing a lot, like people don't believe in religious liberty, but I think that the issue is bigger and broader than that. I think that there are questions and concerns across a broad spectrum. And so I really do think we need to have conversations like we're having, and like some of the breakout sessions are going more deep on particular issues about what is our fundamental understanding of religious liberty that has in the past brought us together, and what part of it can continue to bring us together and hold us together. And I think that one of the biggest things we can do is try to avoid kind of absolute statements about this is destroying religious liberty or this is required for religious liberty, because a lot of times we're just shutting down conversation. So it is a real concern. But I'm not giving up. There are people who aren't giving up, so.
I agree with some of the statements we heard in the very opening session this morning, that it's important to remember that as crucial as religious liberty is, it's not absolute, and it's not the only liberty that matters. And I think that the worries that you may be referencing are people wondering, what are the boundaries of this? How do we talk about religious liberty in the context of love, or justice, or equality? These are also core values that we ought to be striving for. And so there can be some tension, but that's natural. And I doubt that it's the only time in history in which people have struggled with the boundaries of religious power or religious liberty, if we phrase it in that context, vis-a-vis others. And so while it shouldn't be antagonistic, and religious liberty is clearly at the core of the American project, I think asking about its boundaries is legitimate, as we heard at the opening session today.
Yeah, I'd just say to the extent that religious freedom has become a partisan idea, that's terribly troubling. The extent to which, and it's important for politicians, they don't have a whole lot of time to explain or respond, and so I've heard, stories of, let me just say the religious freedom conversation is getting increasingly toxic. And so there's a responsibility we have as advocates to help kind of reset the conversation. But it's also a matter of there has to be an understanding that religious freedom isn't just important when nothing else conflicts with it. It's actually when religious freedom is contested that it's most important. If society, we don't need religious freedom for ideas everybody agrees with, or else those are protected by the political process. What we need is religious freedom for ideas that are contested, that do bump up against other interests, and that sort of idea that you can wave away religious freedom as sort of a lesser right when it's right there in the First Amendment is something we need to push back against.
Yeah, I think the notion that religious freedom is a code word for bigotry and discrimination, and that has become very popular. It is popularized. I'm sorry?
No, and both sides have contributed to that.
Absolutely. But I think I'm hoping that the recent Masterpiece Cake Shop case, even though it didn't have a decision on the merits, did really call into question the name calling, and said, Justice Kennedy said, religious neutrality, it's a fundamental expectation of, that's sort of a threshold. And so animus, the showing of animus toward religious groups in government space and adjudicatory hearings, things of that nature. So I'm hoping that can be the foundation for maybe some better discourse around the questions. So I don't know, but I'm hoping.
Well, thank you. We've reached the end of our time together. I really appreciate the wonderful insights you've shared, each from your own perspective, and your contribution to our discussions here at this conference. Please join me in thanking them for